Hey, what's up there, YouTubers? Edgemans and a joke coming to you guys here today with another deck tech. So today we're going to be taking a look at another standard build, and it is Grixis Control. So a lot of you guys have been asking me to cover Grixis Control, so I decided I was going to put it together. I've been playtesting it in person, doing real-life Magic, and also online as well. And I really like this build, so I'm going to share it with you guys here today. But if you guys have any suggestions for decks that you would like to see, please leave that down in the comments below. And be sure to check out the playlist in the description with all of the previous decks that I've covered. So, with that said, we are going to break this deck down starting with the land base. So we're running 25 lands, starting off with Steam Vents. So Steam Vents is our shock land for blue and red. We're running a play set of it. So we're going to put that down here. From there, we have Blood Crypt. So we'll get an English one here. So we have Blood Crypt, and we're using that as a playset as well. And our black in the deck is more so a splash than anything else. We don't really have a lot of cards that require black mana. We require some more whenever it comes to sideboarding, but as far as the main board goes and everything we're running game one, black isn't too intensive. From there we have Sulfur Falls. So we are running a playset of Sulfur Falls in the deck as well, giving us some more blue and red action. From there we have our Drowned Catacomb, so playset of Drowned Catacomb as well. Then we have Dragonskull Summit, so we're only running 2 of these instead of a playset. We don't really need the black a whole lot. I mean, it's another source of red if anything, but we don't need that playset of Dragonskull Summit for red and black. 2 will suffice, so we're just running 2 of them. From there, we have Nephalia Drownyard, so we're running 2 of these. And this is pretty much just an alternate win condition. Whenever you get into those really, really slow games where not much is happening, you're playing against control or mid-range, you're getting rid of their creatures and all the things that they're doing the same to you. You can start milling them out, so we're running 2 Nephalia Drownyard for that. From there we have 1 Evolving Wilds, so this is in order to fix just a little bit if we need that second source of blue or that third source of red whenever it comes to stuff like Jace Architect of Thought, Talrand, or Mizzium Mortars. But overall, I really do like Evolving Wilds. Later game, just after the fact of how many cards we're going to be using, like the Augur of Bolas, Jace, Architect of Thought, and using their abilities where cards are going to go to the bottom of our library. So I did want to have a way to be able to shuffle up the deck and still kind of keep it fresh. Maybe there was something at the bottom that I wanted to see, and we have a more likely chance to actually see it if it's, I don't know, somewhere in the middle of our deck as opposed to at the very bottom of it. But later game, Evolving Wilds is good for that. Early game, it's just fixing. So 1 Evolving Wilds for that. From there, we have our basics. So we're running 2 basic islands, 1 basic mountain, and 1 basic swamp. So that's the land base for us here. Now we're going to take a look at everything else. So first off, we have our creatures in ascending order. So the first one is Snapcaster Mage, and Snapcaster Mage is just ridiculously awesome. So he's a 2/1 for 2 mana, flash, and whenever he enters the battlefield, he's going to give target instant or sorcery card in our graveyard flashback until the end of the turn. So he gives us good use of flashing back a lot of different spells. So we're running 2 of him. Main board, we have 1 more sideboard whenever we need to start flashing back stuff. And that's against stuff like control, so we can flash back our counter spells. Also against aggro heavy decks, so we can start flashing back Mizzium Mortars, Pillar of Flame to get rid of their things. Cards of that nature, but Snapcaster is just really, really good. From there we have our Augur of Bolas. So he's a 1/3 for 2 mana, enters the battlefield. We can look at the top 3 cards of our library, or well, we're forced to. We may reveal an instant or sorcery card from among them and put it into our hand, and then put the rest of the cards onto the bottom of our library in any order. So we're using him as a 3-of in this build, and he's really good whenever it gets to not really later stages, but kind of like in the middle of the game when you're on turns like 5 and 6 and you already have your land drops underway. You just really need to get all of the meat, all of the just huge bulky instants and sorceries just to get rid of your opponent's stuff, counter their things, remove their creatures, stuff like that. So Augur of Bolas is there once we already have our lands, because we don't want to get caught in the situation where we're stuck on 2 lands, we drop Augur of Bolas hoping to get some removal or something like that. Augur of Bolas is definitely really good. Once you are already underway, you have your tempo there, and he just lets you search, lets you dig a little bit and find instants and sorceries that'll be relevant. So Augur is a 3 of, definitely really nice in the build. Alright, from there we have the big bad Talrand. So a lot of decks haven't really been giving him much love, but I've been playtesting with him and I really like him in this build. So he's a 2/2 for 4 mana, and he's double blue. Whenever you cast an instant or a sorcery spell, put a 2/2 blue Drake creature token onto the battlefield, and that creature has flying, which is pretty enormous. So we're actually running 3 of them in the build, and with the amount of removal that we have, this is a perfect mid-range-ish type of card where we drop him, we let our opponent do whatever they're going to do, and if they don't get rid of him, they're pretty much screwed, because we have the upper hand, we have the removal, we have the counter spells. Even if we're using Think Twice, Talrand is going to give us a lot of dudes really easily, and whether they're chump blockers or swingers, that it depends on the matchup, on the board state already and stuff like that, but the fact that he produces a lot of dudes for you is really, really good. So we're running him as a 3 of. We want to see him somewhat consistently. From there we have Niv-Mizzet, Draco Genius. So 5/5 for 6 flying, and whenever he deals damage to a player, get to draw a card, and for 1 blue and 1 red he has an ability where he deals 1 damage to target creature or player. So aside from him being able to ping your opponent's creatures and get rid of them if they're small enough, he's really good just because he can draw just a huge amount of cards for you for very little mana. So whenever you cast him, if you have the spare mana open, like if you're sitting at 8 lands, you play him and you have the 1 blue and 1 red, then you can draw a card off of him there, and then even go forward to do it again next turn. And the best thing about it is it's not just, 2 mana, draw a card. It's 2 mana, deal damage, and you can draw a card, which is really nice because it's just going to get you so much closer to actually winning the game, especially if your opponent can't block evasion, which oftentimes seems to be the case. But we're running 2 Niv-Mizzets in the build. He's another really huge powerhouse creature. If you don't get rid of him, he just gets you all of the things with drawing and deals all the damage. From there, we have Jace, Architect of Thought. So this big, bad, inexpensive Planeswalker. We're running him as a 4 of. He's really tremendous in this type of a build. He's really good. He's a 4-cost Planeswalker. His +1 is until your next turn. Creatures your opponent controls, if they attack, they're going to get -1, -0 until the end of the turn. So he protects himself all right. It's not anything tremendous, but his -2 ability is where we're really going to be resting all of our reliance in. So the -2 is reveal the top 3 cards of your library. You get to separate them, or well, your opponent has to separate them into 2 piles. You get to keep 1 pile, the other pile goes to the bottom of your library. So he gives you some card advantage, definitely. He lets you pick the best thing out of one of those 2 piles, and you get to keep it, and hopefully the other pile isn't too good that you're throwing it away to the bottom of your library. But more times than none, your opponent's going to be at such a huge disadvantage with what they want to let you have and what you're actually going to take. And oftentimes they don't even know. They can look at the board state, but they don't know what all you have in your hand either. So Jace is just tremendous as a utility Planeswalker. Running him as a 4 of is just really nice. From there we have Tamiyo, the Moon Sage. So we're running 2 of her. So Tamiyo is really nice as well. 4 loyalty, 5 cost, +1. She taps down a permanent and doesn't untap during its next untap step. -2, draw cards equal to the amount of tapped creatures target player controls. And the -8 is where we want to be. We get an emblem where we don't have a maximum hand size, so we can have as many cards in our hand as we want. We don't have to discard them. And anytime a card goes to the graveyard, or well, to our graveyard from anywhere, we can put it into our hand instead. So if we have a ton of red mana and we have 1 Pillar of Flame with the emblem out, we can essentially win. And I've had it happen a lot of times. And I think that's the funniest way to win with Tamiyo emblem. But moving on, we have Nicol Bolas Planeswalker, so another big, bad, and bulky card. 5 loyalty, 8 cost, really expensive, but his +3, destroy target non-creature permanent, which is really relevant. -2, gain control of target creature, and -9, just wrecks face and just smashes all the things. Deals 7 damage to target player. They have to discard 7 cards and sacrifice 7 permanents, so if you get his ultimate off, you're pretty much well in your ways to win. Alright, so those are our Planeswalkers. From there, we have Runechanter's Pike, and Runechanter's Pike is extremely interesting in this build based on what your opponent's going to be playing the next turn. Whenever it comes to game 1, you really want to reveal this card and let your opponent know, like, oh, I'm playing Runechanter's Pike, especially if you've already played Talrand and not revealed much else like the Niv-Mizzets or anything like that. If they don't know what deck you're playing, they're going to assume that you're playing off of Runechanter's Pike very heavily, but we're only running it as a one-of, just because we have the synergy here, but we don't rely on it. So if they start siding in stuff like Rest in Peace, Graveyard Removal, stuff like that, they've really just made a bad decision in that, and I think a lot of people would assume that as soon as they see Runechanter's Pike, and I've had it happen in a lot of matches where it'll go into game 2 and they're like, alright, well, rest in peace, now you can't use your Runechanter's Pike, but in reality we have so many other things that we can do in this deck, and Runechanter's Pike is just a one-up. We're not even assured that we're going to draw it. We can win with other things, but Runechanter's Pike is nice in the deck. 2 to play, 2 to equip. The equipped creature gets first strike and +X/+0, where X is the number of instants and sorceries in our grave. So it's really nice, and I love it when people start siding in graveyard hate against Runechanter's Pike, because it really doesn't net them any advantage. From there, we have Rakdos' Return, and all I have is my Japanese version one, but it's a X, 1 black and 1 red, and target opponent is going to discard X amount of cards and they're going to lose X amount of life. So Rakdos' Return is really awesome, especially against mid-range and control. You're able to make them discard all of their things. If you're able to figure out when the best and optimal time is to actually cast it, and you have all the mana open and you know they're not going to counter it, that's probably the best time to cast it. So they have like 5 cards in hand, no mana open, you have the ability to play Rakdos' Return for 5. That's when you want to play. You want to not let them have anything, and against mid-range and control, that's exactly what we want to do. Against aggro stuff, Rakdos' Return, it sides out. It's not as good. We want to have more removal, but against mid-range and control, it's really good. So from there, we have Syncopate. So we're running Syncopate as a 2-of in the board, so X amount of mana and 1 blue, counter target spell unless its controller pays X amount of mana. If it's countered that way, exile it instead of putting it into its owner's graveyard. So it's a nice way to counter things. There's also the exile clause, which can be relevant, or it could not be relevant at all, but Syncopate's definitely good as a counter spell early game and late game if we leave the mana open for it. From there, we have our draw spells. So Think Twice, pretty standard. We have 3 Think Twice. You can play it, you can flashback it for 3 mana. We also have Forbidden Alchemy that is going to let us dig, and digging with this deck is really nice. On top of that, it synergizes with Runechanter's Pike, not intentionally. It's not like, oh, alright, I'm going to discard or let Forbidden Alchemy take all of the instants and sorceries into my grave so I can power up Runechanter's Pike. It's not necessarily how we operate it unless we have a clear shot and no response where we can win off of it. But Forbidden Alchemy does synergize with Runechanter's Pike, and it does let us dig into other bigger things. Maybe if it's a Talrand or a Niv-Mizzet to just bash face. But Forbidden Alchemy is definitely really nice. It has the flashback. It's pretty expensive, but the flashback is capable of being resolved. It's never really a problem to get the 7 mana, especially in a control deck. From there, we have Pillar of Flame. So 1 red deals 2 damage to target creature or player. If a creature dealt damage this way would die during the turn, it's exiled instead. So it's an easy way to deal with creatures, especially with zombie shenanigans and stuff like that. So it's exiled instead of dying. You get rid of Drops Messengers, Grave Crawlers, annoying stuff like that. We're running 3 Pillar of Flame. Alright, so from there we have Mizzium Mortars. So Mizzium Mortars is another awesome card. We're running it as a 3 of, and it's 1 generic, 1 red, and it deals 4 damage to target creature we don't control. Overload for 6 mana, 3 generic, and triple red, which is intensive, but not out of reach with this deck because of how many sources of red we have. Triple red is never a problem. But Mizzium Mortars for the overload is really nice against Entreat tokens, against creature-heavy aggro decks, especially anything that has a lot of creatures under 4 power, or 4 toughness, should I say, 4 power and toughness. But Mizzium Mortars really just wrecks face, and even as just spot removal for 2 mana, it's really good. But I like using it against stuff like Entreat the Angels because decks will try to resolve it, and you already can foresee yourself playing it, so I mean, you're not really worried about it. Mizzium Mortars is definitely really good in this build, even though it's no Bonfire where it's going to be dealing damage to the player too. Mizzium Mortars is definitely more optimal here because we're drawing so much, and we're digging and all the things like that, so we have much more use out of running Mizzium Mortars. From there, we have Dreadbore. So Dreadbore is destroy target creature or planeswalker for 2 mana. So 1 black and 1 red. We're running 2 of them. We also have more in the sideboard if need be whenever it comes to mid-range and creature-heavy stuff if we really need the removal. If it's really quick-paced aggro, then we need the side in Dreadbore. But I find myself siding it in more so for mid-range than anything else. And it's definitely good for that because their big point where they're relying on stuff is going to be both in planeswalkers and also in creatures as well. So we can kind of hit both of them. And then we're running 1 Sever the Bloodline main board, and we also have 1 in the sideboard. But 4 mana, sorcery, exiles target creature and all other creatures with the same name. And as a flashback as well. So we can flash it back, and we have 2 uses out of it for... once for 4 mana, the second time for 7 mana, which isn't too bad. So, yeah, so that's the main board. Now we're going to take a look at the sideboard and the options that we have. So, for our options, we have 1 more Snapcaster Mage whenever it comes to needing to have more ways to flashback stuff. So, whenever it comes to more counter spells, more removal, being able to reuse cards, Snapcaster becomes relevant. We don't always need to have them, but definitely when our opponent has a lot of big things that we need to counter, he becomes handy. We have our counter spells here, so we have Dissipates. So we're running 2 Dissipates in the side. So it's pretty much like Syncopate. It's 3 mana, so it's always a constant. Double blue, which is intensive but not too horrible. Early game it might be a nuisance, but late game it should never provide any grief. Counter target spell, if it's countered that way, it's exiled instead. So we have 2 of the Dissipates. Negates, we're running 2 of these sideboard as well. Anything with non-creature spells, mainly control. It's a good deterrent for control. Essence Scatter, mid-range, and also some slower-paced creature-heavy decks. Mid-range, I want to say more so because they rely on cards that are going to be like Huntmaster of the Fells, Thragtusk, bigger things. Essence Scatter isn't necessarily good against small creatures where it's like, oh, well, I'm going to be playing like turn 1 creatures, turn 2 creatures, and stuff like that. Essence Scatter is much better whenever it comes into the 5 drops, the 4 drops, and anything higher than that. So we have a way to actually be able to counter those spells if they're trying to resolve them. So 1 Essence Scatter for that reason. I want to say Jund mid-range and the Junk mid-range decks see a lot of siding with Essence Scatter, but whenever you see the opportunity and it's good enough, side it in. From there we have Liliana of the Veil, so we're running her as a 2 of in the sideboard as well. She's good against control, mid-range again, anything where you want to deplete their hand size. I'll also side it in against slower aggro decks that are trying to like build up creatures and do like exalted stuff, not necessarily where they're just trying to make an enormous board state with a bunch of dudes and just overwhelm from there. If they're trying to play off of exalted and stuff like that, Liliana is a little bit more permissible. I could understand siding it in, but she's mainly more for mid-range and control, and I like siding her in for that because you can make him discard cards. Sure, you're going to be discarding too, but at the same time, it's putting your opponent at a, I think, much bigger disadvantage. The -2 is relevant as well, where they have to sacrifice a creature, and the -6, where you get to separate their permanents into 2 piles, they get to keep one, the other one goes away, is also very relevant as well. The ultimate is very good, and if you can resolve it, you are in the clear pretty much for at least a couple of turns, and until they can catch back up if you haven't already won by that point. From there, we have Slaughter Games. So we're running 2 Slaughter Games in the sideboard. So Slaughter Games can't be countered. We can name a card, and we have the opportunity to search our opponent's graveyard, deck, and library for cards of that name, and we get to exile them. So Slaughter Games is really awesome. You mainly name stuff like Angel of Serenity, Thragtusk, even when it comes down to control, I guess, Entreat the Angels if they're running Entreat the Angels, but it's been very lackluster right now because it has a lot of hate. Jace, Architect of Thought, and Memory Adept as well, because control decks will start siding them in. There's a lot of different things. The more you play around Slaughter Games and the more you play competitive Magic, you'll know what to name, but if you're just playing against your buddies and you're doing casual, you can just you can name whatever you know that they're playing, but for serious competitive Magic, you should know what you're going to be naming if you have some experience with the meta and what's going on. But Slaughter Games is really good. Mainly, you want to get rid of Thragtusk. Thragtusk is so annoying in the format. We have Sever the Bloodline, so another copy of it for more removal. Just outright removal for tokens, just being able to exile more creatures, I guess, against zombies as well, even though zombies isn't as hugely played as people thought it was going to be. Sever the Bloodline is still good. It's an exile target creature spell, has a flashback. We have 2 of them in between the sideboard and the main board. From there, we are running more Pillar of Flame, so 1 more in the sideboard. So again, whenever it comes down to creature-heavy decks where they have a lot of small creatures and try to overwhelm the board state, and sometimes maybe they'll even overcommit, but Pillar of Flame definitely is a really easy way to get rid of stuff early on and just burn out your opponent's creatures, and it's really good against zombies. If you run into zombies, it's really nice because of that exile clause. Same goes with Annihilating Fire, even though a lot of people don't think it's really as permissible and constructed, and it's kind of a clunky card to work around in Standard, and it isn't necessarily the best. Searing Spear does the same thing except for exiling, but the fact that it exiles is why I like to use it, and double red isn't too intensive for this type of a build. We have enough sources of red where this card is very permissible and you can flash it back fairly easily. But Annihilating Fire, really good against stuff like mid-range when it comes into Vampire Nighthawks, Key Runes, getting rid of Thragtusk and exiling it away from builds like Reanimator so they can't use Unburial Rites on it. Just stuff like that. Annihilating Fire is good, but we only run it as a one-of for situations where we might need it. But against aggro, it's obviously good. And we have 1 more Dreadbore here, so 1 black, 1 red, destroy target creature or planeswalker. We can set it in if we need it for more of a heavy control against creatures and planeswalkers, mainly like Jund mid-range, other mid-range builds and stuff like that. But Dreadbore is just all around good. So we have that. And then our last card here is Ultimate Price. So Ultimate Price is kind of interesting because it's strictly worse than Go for the Throat and Doomblade, but it's still not unplayable. There's definitely a lot of decks that this card can still hit and a lot of creatures that it can get rid of. So we still run it as a one-of in the sideboard. Whenever it comes to humans and getting rid of Thragtusks and stuff like that, Ultimate Price is definitely really good. I think against a lot of Reanimator decks, you can get rid of Angels, you can get rid of Thragtusks, also the Restoration Angel as well. There's a lot of things that Ultimate Price hits, so it's definitely not far-fetched to see it in sideboards. I wouldn't necessarily play it in the main board by any means, but sideboard-wise, if you see a deck where they're not running very many multicolored cards, you're able to just start getting rid of their non-multicolored creatures. So ultimate price is definitely still relevant, easily flashback with Snapcaster as well. So that is the Grixis control list that I have here for you guys today. If you guys enjoyed it, please be sure to like, favorite, and subscribe for more Magic the Gathering content. Be sure to check out the links down below, mainly the playlist that I have of all the previous decks that I've covered. And remember to have yourself a wonderful, fun-filled Magic the Gathering day, guys.